Today we're talking about Android design patterns, and there's a bunch of things to consider about Android. The biggest is that you don't just try to make it just iOS on a different screen. You really need to dig into the unique cultural constraints that you find inside of the Android ecosystem and really understand that unique perspective. And as you've seen from things like the introduction of material design, there really is a fundamental difference in thinking between iOS and Android. We're going to get into some of those changes, but those differences, but before we do that, it's worth thinking about the user base. So the user base for Android really is in this funny space inside of the market. So iOS kind of consumes the high-end to medium high-end part of the market for folks that that are willing to pay extra for premium products. Android, however, follows kind of a bell curve or a bathtub curve where the super low end is all Android, and then there's some enthusiasts at the super high end. So it's a really interesting dynamic, and you can see that that dynamic plays out in some of the design considerations inside of material design. You'll see that by leaning into the natural mapping that material design leans into, it kind of addresses folks on the low end of the market, but at the same time, by being so customizable and flexible, it leans into the high end of the market. At the baseline, though, it's crucial to understand the vision of material design. In iOS, the kind of key vision is that the user's content is elevated and everything else serves it, and that there's a minimalistic approach to everything around it. In material design, it's different. Instead, the next actionable step is highly emphasized. We'll look at that. The information, obviously this is a Google product, so the information that's available is highly emphasized. And then AI and machine learning and intelligence drives a lot of other elements of material design. Again, these last two leaning into Google's strengths. At its base, the metaphor material design cannot be underestimated, the materialness of material design. It really is about appearing to be like sheets of paper that slide around in space. The scope of material design is broad. So in contrast, you can see the human interface guidelines for iOS define iOS, which is just for phones, versus material design covers everything from wearable to mobile to tablet to web to desktop to TV. Imagine how broad of categories those are. How much bigger a wearable is in comparison to a TV. The size difference is enormous. And yet material design strives to move fluidly between all of these spaces. Now, Apple clearly has addressed this by doing things like unifying the look and feel across multiple platforms. So for instance, the newest versions of the Mac share a lot of visual language with the iPhone. This shares a lot of the visual language with iPad. This shares a lot of visual language with Apple TV, which honestly even shares some visual language with Apple TV. And so they are addressing a broad range of devices in the same way. However, material design strives not to define these segments, but instead kind of moves seamlessly along the continuum from as small as wearable devices all the way up to televisions. What that means is that material design has to play nicely on a lot of different devices, a lot of different devices. You know, when you look at iOS, it's easy to get overwhelmed by how many iPhones there are if you are trying to design something that works just a couple years back. But imagine in material design, Android is open sourced. So there's a plethora of device manufacturers making thousands, perhaps even in the millions of different types of devices, all that use material design, all with different hardware, different screen resolutions, different capabilities, different speeds, different storage options, just a ton. And so material design not only has to be flexible in the size that they're addressing, from wearable to television and everything between, but also has to be flexible in working inside of all of these various devices. And each one of those manufacturers that's making their own Android devices are also then putting their own skin on top of it. So not only is material design working across a broad range of devices, and inside of each one of those segments, a near infinite number of manufacturers, but each one of those manufacturers is applying their own design language on top of it. All that is to say is that it's complex. It's a very complex ecosystem with multiple app stores and multiple delivery points, multiple types of devices, all those kinds of things. It's a very complex ecosystem. However, at its core, to simplify things for you, remember one of the key tenets of this class. Input defines interface. It's not the other way around. Just like we talked about before, punch cards were the interface into early computers, and that defined what you could do with it. Then the mouse came along, and that defined what you could do with it. Then you had touch, and that defined what you can do with it. Same thing here with Android. So let's get back into its input. And understanding the key components of input in Android is to understand what it is and what it is not. And what it is not is a reaction to iPhone. A lot of people think that it is because they kind of are in a race with each other. But really, Android is a reaction to BlackBerry, which is a now defunct company, but it was based primarily around hardware keys. And so here's one of the more popular BlackBerry devices, and you can see that these hardware keys are the keyboard. And it's kind of optimized all around this keyboard for high-end users, so business class people. In fact, this is the first Android that was released. First Android device that was released. You can see it expands to have a hardware keyboard inside of it. Really interesting product. And that is where Android has evolved from being very hardware key centric. And so, in fact, the iPhone came along after this product was being developed for Android, which had very few hardware keys. And you can see the evolution of Android devices over time has moved away from these hardware keys being at the bottom and being literal physical keys to being software keys on screens. But at the same time, they're always there. So understanding these buttons, I think, is crucial to understanding the Android ecosystem. We talked about the diversity of devices. This diversity of device applies to these buttons. But at the core, those buttons along the bottom remain the same. And we'll get back to that in a second. So despite this diversity of devices, it really behooves us to kind of lean into finding a device that is the cornerstone device, the device that everything else is kind of based on, a kind of lingua franca device, kind of standardized device, and that is Google's Pixel. The Pixel came out in 2016 and was an evolution of some other hardware that Google had been working on. And the key thing about the Pixel is that it's kind of an everyone device. It's made for the mass market. It's not a super high-end device. But it kind of captures where Google is trying to drive Android and where it's trying to drive material design. And you can see here, the buttons exist along the bottom. Let's dig into those buttons and talk about what each one does. This first one is the back button. It is similar to the button in the top right corner of iOS, where you can go back screens within an app. The next button is the home screen button. This kind of returns you back to your grid of apps. And the next button is kind of a disclosure button. It kind of provides more information for a variety of things. Sometimes, in some contexts, that's view all the apps that you have running. In others, it might be very app-specific things. This kind of varies from platform to platform, from device to device, and manufacturer to manufacturer. But you can kind of think of this as like a disclosure button, showing me more than I would normally be able to get to. Within apps, we're going to break down the navigation the same way that we did iOS. Within apps, they have this concept called an app bar. And there's a couple different app bars. The ones along the top is what we're going to look at first. First, on the left-hand side, you have the hamburger menu. This is opens and closes panels of navigation. Then you obviously have the page title. And then you have kind of extra widgets that exist inside of the top bar. This is almost always a search button because, again, Google. But it might be other things like this, like heart, favorite, star, that sort of thing. And then another disclosure button. This is usually highly contextual. So if you were to be on a contact and an address book, this button might disclose, like, there's the delete button for this specific contact, things like that. Let's drill into this one. This is the drawer, and it expands and collapses out of the left-hand side, and it's a primary navigational element. So in iOS, the primary navigational element is the global navigation bar along the bottom, the kind of tab bar. There are tab bars in Android, but not as popular. Instead, material design highly encourages primary navigation existing inside of the drawer. Also along the top is this. The drop-down menu, kind of contextual menu, kind of allows you to do things to the specific element that you have selected. It's important to note the distinction between these two. The drawer and the drop-down menu are two very different things. The drawer is for global navigation, whereas this contextual drop-down menu is tied to the local element that you're looking at. Also along the top app bar will display the back button. So this back button is the same thing as the hardware back button along the bottom of the display. It's harder to reach from an ergonomic perspective up in the top left corner, but it does disclose. Note that the style of the arrow is different than you have in iOS. Do not get those arrows mixed up. Let's talk about segmented controls. Segmented controls are a relatively minor thing in iOS, but pretty massive in material design. So let's say you have an app that was for keeping track of all of your pets. The segmented controls across the top would be kind of mid-level navigational elements. If you think of like a large hierarchy of navigation, you have your global, which is like your main primary sections. Those are going to live inside of the drawer. But then the next level down, where you kind of move within subsections, that's going to exist inside of the segmented controls. It's also worth noting how segmented controls are animated. So you can have two different recordings here, the one in the middle and the far right, shows you how material design conceptualizes how they animate between segment controls. That it's like sheets of paper that are literally moving underneath the app, moving from left to right. Calls to action are the other primary difference inside of Android and material design. In iOS, calls to action sometimes are hidden down as a centerpiece of a tab bar controller, like you see on the left. Sometimes they're hidden in corners of the screen. In material design, they're front and center. Specifically, this big purple or this pink button we call the floating action button. Floating action buttons, or fabs, are absolutely crucial in material design. They're a key component of material design, and you see them everywhere. What they are is they're kind of calls to the next actionable step for the user. Specifically, they need to be positive things that you want the user to do, not negative things like deleting, but they're positive next actions like create new documents, create new emails, that sort of business. Here's a variety of them. Here you can see that in an email client, the fab button will be create new email. In getting directions, you can occasionally, although it's discouraged in material design, you can occasionally have multiple fabs, but there's still always the primary one. So here in the middle, you have the kind of navigation tool, a map, and you can hit the fab is give me directions. The secondary fab is pinpoint my location. Fabs also do not have to live in the lower right-hand corner. That's definitely their most common location, but it is totally valid to have them along the top and the left, like you see here with in this My Files example. The fab button is create new file. Here's some examples of good fab icons. They're not always plus signs. You have things like create new, edit, star, heart, reply, etc., etc., etc. The key component of fab is that it's the next primary action you want the user to take from any given screen. They're always positive and they're non-destructive actions. In contrast, these are bad fabs. These are things you don't want to do. You don't want to have things like move this message into a different folder or delete things. You also don't want to have little indicators as to, for instance, how many messages are available inside of something. Or you also don't want things to be ambiguous. So the number 5 is, for instance, is ambiguous in a fab. Or go back. That's not where go back belongs. It belongs in the upper left-hand corner or leaning into the hardware buttons. Fabs are the next actionable thing that are positive and non-destructive that you want the user to do. Another major component of material design is sheets. This makes sense. Material design is all about trying to mimic real-world things and through natural mapping and having like sheets of paper that slide around. And so sheets exist on top of existing things. Sheets also exist in iOS. However, they take a back seat. They're not quite as prominent inside of iOS as they are inside of Android. Another component of sheets that's important to note here in this example and throughout sheets in Android, they're a little bit larger and they contain way more information. Again, in material design, You want to emphasize action, that's the fab, but you also want to emphasize information. So for instance, if I were to pull up a map for this location on iOS, the map would be larger and I might have the title of it and a phone number and a button to get directions. It would have to press something in iOS in order to expand that sheet in order to get more information about it. But in material design, that information is elevated and constantly available. Action sheets exist in iOS. We've talked about them. Same concept exists in material design in the form of what they call bottom sheets. There's a couple different styles they can take. The grid is relatively similar between the two. They both exist on 8 digital pixel grids. However, as you can see in material design, touch targets are slightly larger, 4 digital pixels larger to 48 digital pixels. What that means is no axis of any button should be smaller than 48 digital pixels. So it shouldn't be smaller vertically or horizontally. Typography is crucial inside of material design. The primary font inside of material design is Roboto. There's a couple different versions. There's a sans serif and a serif version. The most common is the sans serif. And you can see it has a lot of nice different weights and variations inside of Roboto. This is all available for download for free. There's also in-app glyphs, just like there are in-app glyphs inside of iOS. And you can see that they share similar visual language to Roboto. However, they are distinct from the iOS glyphs. The iOS glyphs are really open. The material design glyphs are closed and a little bit bolder and heavier. Let's contrast buttons. In iOS, buttons have the style that is on the left-hand side. Buttons in material design are like those on the right. You can see there's 2 different status contexts for material design on the right-hand side, so kind of normal buttons and then bolded buttons. It's worth noting that things are in caps on buttons usually when you want to draw attention to them in material design far more frequently than they are in iOS. Tabs along the bottom do exist. Like I mentioned, they're relatively uncommon in material design. Instead, you want to lean into the drawer for global navigation and segment controls for sub-navigation. Next steps. I want you to lean in more into understanding material design. This is just a high-level overview. There's all kinds of resources available for material design that you have access to, and there's a ton of stuff that you should really dig in, especially if you want to do things like filtering and searching, any kind of AI elements. That's all part of material design spec, and you should definitely check it out before you move forward.